Hello and welcome to lecture number 7 of photorealistic and non-photorealistic rendering. I'm your instructor as always, Leslie Eisted, and in today's lecture we are going to wrap up our discussion of photorealistic rendering with a smorgasbord of topics that we've kind of left, but hopefully it'll kind of fill in the remainder of our picture of how to create a photorealistic image. Just a few things before we dive into that. Of course, assignment 3 is posted if you haven't taken a look at that. The other thing is that we'll be posting tutorial slides almost every week now on Brightspace, so make sure you take a look at that. The other thing is that your midterm is tomorrow. If you haven't seen the test midterm, which was really just a few questions, sample questions, please make sure you check them out, as that will become unavailable later tonight. And then the midterm, of course, will be on Tuesday morning at 8:30 till 10:30 or something like that. Now, what's the format of the midterm? So it's an online quiz, just like the sample questions that were provided to you. There are true-false questions, there are multiple choice questions, there's fill in the blanks, there's ordering questions, things like that. There's also some small calculation questions as well. Really, the questions that were presented as the sample questions were a direct comparison to what you should expect to see on the midterm itself. The coverage of the midterm is lectures 1 through 6, so this lecture is not on the midterm, so no worries about scrambling to learn today's content for tomorrow. But other than that, I think it should be fairly straightforward. It's open book. You can use the slides, you can use the videos, whatever you like. And apologize for the scratchy voice. We'll try to get through this. All right. So let's look at our wrap-up. So I want to start by talking about a couple effects that are related to the camera, because that's something we haven't really talked a lot about. When we were looking at the perspective view transformation matrix, you notice that the field of view and the near and far clipping planes were taken into consideration, but we didn't really account for all the varying parts of the camera and the different effects that you can create. And if you open up anything like Houdini, let's just open Houdini up here, and you open up the camera, I'll move it so it's in view here. There we go. And on the camera, well, that's not what I want. I didn't want to double click on the camera. And you go to render and view, you can actually see here's a bunch of parameters for the camera itself. We can set the focal length and the aperture. And then if we hit sampling, we also have a focus distance and an f-stop and a kind of bokeh that you want. But we haven't really talked about how to get these effects. Now, I'm not going to talk about how to get things like bokeh and so on, but what I did want to talk about is how to create the depth of field effect. Because when you're actually creating a photorealistic scene, this is actually a really powerful tool. Because when we think about photography, it typically has depth of field in it. And what's really nice about depth of field when we are doing rendering is we can kind of use it to hide things that may not be so accurate. So you could use depth of field to hide things in the background and also hide things in the foreground, which is kind of nice. But how does that actually get implemented? So just for reference, for example, now this is a photo. This is not a rendered image. This is an actual photo. But if I were trying to create this particular image and turn it into a photorealistic rendering, I would note that organic materials are exceptionally difficult to create photorealistic versions of. And so by having just the rose itself in the main focus area, I can blur out the regions behind and I won't notice if it's just an image. So this is the kind of thing that why we want it, even though, yes, this is a photo. Well, in In order to create this, we have to make the observation that depth of field is actually a product of the camera lens itself, the actual mechanics. We have the aperture, which is how much is open to light. So in this first diagram here from Wikipedia, you can see that the aperture is all the way open. And then for the second one here, where we have a small aperture, you can see here that it's very small. So it's how much light are we actually letting into the camera. Then we have the idea of lens focal length. So where is the lens actually going to be focusing? And what is the length or the size of the region that it's capable of focusing on? And we also have this issue of the circle of confusion. Now, what we can see here when we take these things together is that when you have a large aperture, you've got 3 different objects, the red one, the blue one, and the green one. And yes, they are flipped upside down here, and that is because, of course, that's just how lens optics work. So the object number 1, which is really far away, when it goes through the lens, we can see here that the focal point of where number 1 comes into focus is not on the image plane. It's before the image plane, which means that it's going to be out of focus. Likewise, the green lines are going to be focusing beyond the image plane, which means they're also going to be out of focus. And only the things that actually come into focus at the point of the image plane will be in focus in the image. So here we're getting some depth of field from objects that are in front and objects that are behind. Now, how aperture can play a role here is you can see here that even though object 1 and 3 are still out of focus, what's interesting is that the size of the objects is changed due to the size of the aperture. So you can see from these diagrams how aperture and focal length can really impact our implementation of depth of field. Now, this is just looking at the physics of it. When we actually implement it, though, we are going to recreate these diagrams just with rays now. Now, originally what we had, I can actually break out something to doodle on here. What we used to have was a camera. And then we had an image plane, and we would send a ray into the world through some point in the image plane. Well, we're not quite going to do this anymore. What we're actually going to do is we're going to effectively simulate the lens being in front of this. So what we're doing now is we're going to send a ray through the original image plane, and it's going to go through the camera lens, and these lines are a little bit out of whack. And it's going to go through this fake circular lens that we've placed in front of the pixel, and that is going to bend the light, and it's going to go through another pixel on our new image plane into the world. And how the light rays are bent according to this artificial lens is going to create a focal distance, and the focal distance will be from the center of this lens to the center of this point here. Now, we can't just send one ray in order to do this, because if we did that, then it wouldn't make a lot of sense. So what we actually do is instead of sending one ray per pixel, now we're going to send a whole bunch of rays per pixel. And effectively what we do, I'm going to open up my diagrams here, is we've got this fake lens, and we're going to subdivide it into a grid. Now, the truth is you don't have to use a circle to get this effect. You can actually just do a rectangular or square-based grid. But in each of the little grid elements, we are going to choose a random spot. And we're going to send a ray through each of these random spots in the lens. And then we are going to compute the average over all of these rays that we send through the lens. And that is going to give us the blurred effect. It's actually quite simple to do. Probably the hardest thing, though, is actually computing the aperture and the lens, but there's basic math available online for you to see that. And if we go into things like Houdini, this is very easy again to do. We can set the focal distance here. We can set the f-stop here, the bokeh, and then the aperture you can set, of course, over here. Now, when we do this and we send multiple rays per pixel, that is going, and then we average the results, that will give us the depth of field that we want. It's not the only way. So one of the problems with that particular method is that you have to send a lot of rays. If you only send like 4 rays or 16 rays, you are going to get a very grainy looking depth of field or a very blocky looking depth of field. What you really want to do is send 25 or more rays, so a 5x5 or higher grid size, because you want there to be as many samples as possible to give you the softest, most realistic results. So it's a little bit slower because now instead of having 1 ray per pixel, you could have 25 or 100 rays per pixels. Another approach that you can use to create depth of field, and there are a lot of different approaches, but this is one I've also used, and this is you apply a Gaussian blur or any other kind of blur to pixels at different depths. So for example, what you would do is you would find all the pixels at the furthest depth and you apply the largest Gaussian blur to them. And then you take all the pixels from the next layer in front and you apply a slightly smaller blur to them, stick them on, composite them on, with each one moving towards the focal region, having less and less blur applied. And then as you move away from the focal region again, you start applying more and more blur. And that is another way that you can simulate a depth of field effect. It's actually a little bit cheaper to do this, but the results are not as accurate. I've actually used this depth of field technique that's described here to add depth of field to stereo 3D images, which did not have depth of field to start with. So what this ends up looking like, so this is just 3 random metallic balls in Houdini, and this one has no depth of field applied to it. So you see, as you can see, each of these spheres is perfectly crisp and clear. We can see everything nicely in them. When we adjust the parameters for the depth of field, it now takes the other balls out of focus. So the front one is still perfectly in focus, the blue one is starting to get out of focus, and the red one is even more so out of focus. And maybe you can't see this that well on this particular image in the video feed, but this is actually kind of grainy, and the reason why it's grainy is because we didn't send enough rays per pixel. If we send more rays per pixel, you will get a much smoother result. Now that actually leads into a discussion of something that if you do any reading about depth of field for ray tracing online, you'll come up with this word, distributed ray tracing. And I want to say it's such a bad name for what this is. Because when I think of distributed, I am not thinking of what they're referring to. When I hear the word distributed, I'm thinking of taking the job of ray tracing and distributing the work over multiple computers. That is so not what they're referring to here. What distributed ray tracing actually means is that we are distributing the final results computation over a multitude of rays. So it means we're going to send more than 1 ray per pixel, and the final color is the average of all of the results of those rays. And there's 2 different I mean, you can do lots of different things with distributed ray tracing. Depth of field is one example of an algorithm that uses distributed ray tracing. Another is anti-aliasing. We have seen before that when you send only one ray per pixel, that the image is still kind of blocky. But if we send multiple rays per pixel, we get smoother, more accurate results. The best way to do this is, again, to form that grid in the pixel, and then for each grid point, or each grid square, you're going to choose a random position inside of it to send a new ray. So that slight perturbation is going to give some variation in the direction of the array. And then we average all the results up and we get a nice smooth result. Now, distributed ray tracing is also known by others as stochastic ray tracing, although I have not seen it referred to that very often. And obviously, if we're doing distributed ray tracing, it is going to be more expensive because now we are sending, once again, more rays into the scene. So another camera thing we should talk about is stereo 3D cameras. When we're filming a movie that does real stereo 3D of like a real shot, there's a few different ways that people do it. They can either film it in 3D using two cameras, or they can convert it to 3D later. One of the advantages, of course, of an animated movie in 3D is that you can just render it from day one in 3D because the camera isn't real either. And how we render or create that 3D effect is, well, we have two eyes, which means that our brain is processing two separate images. And so we're going to render the scene using two separate cameras. Now, how we get that illusion of depth is actually if you know that when you have two images that were taken with a small separation between them, objects are going to be at slightly different positions in the left and right. So here's an example here. This is actually a ray traced 3D image. This does not use Houdini. That's why there's no logo here. This is my own homebrewed ray tracer. But you can see that the objects in these scenes are actually in different positions. Not all of them, but some of them are. That small amount of horizontal separation, this is a slightly better way of looking at it, the small amount of horizontal separation, your brain actually interprets that as depth. So when we want to ray trace a 3D scene to give that illusion of depth, we need to actually have two cameras which are horizontally separated. And that's exactly what I've done in my own ray tracer, is I have a special stereo camera object, which is just two cameras that are having the same parameters, but their position is separated by just a small horizontal distance. And if you open up Houdini, they actually have a stereo camera built in. It's right here. We can drop it into the scene. And then you can go over to view, and we've got things like aperture again, and that's going to control the aperture for both lenses. Now there's a special stereo settings, and in stereo settings, we can actually set some of the stereo properties. For example, the interaxial distance, which is the separation between the two camera lenses. Now, when we're talking about the human visual system, we talk about interocular distance, which is the distance between your two eyes, the center of your eyes, pupils. But on a camera, we've referred to it as interaxial, or IA. So right now, this is set to 0.075. And I can increase it, and what you can see here is the two little reference cameras are actually being exposed. Now what's really cool is if we actually look through the stereo camera, we have nothing in the scene here. We should put an object in the scene. Let's put an object in the scene. It's in front of the camera, so that's not very useful. So let's push this behind the camera. There we go. And let's push this down. There we go. So now when I look through my stereo camera, I see the ball, and there's two copies because one of them is for the left eye and one of them is for the right eye. And if I click on that stereo camera rig again, and I go back to the inner axial distance, I can pull it together and push it apart. Now, what is the effects of changing the inner axial distance? The effect is going to be when you have a really small inner axial, the amount of separation between the images will be very, very small. And that is actually going to be interpreted as flatter or less depth. Whereas when you have a large inner axial, that is giving you more separation, which is generally interpreted as greater depth. All right. So that's fun. So you don't have to use a stereo camera. So some applications like Houdini do have specialty stereo cameras just for this. My own ray tracer, I did build a special stereo camera just for it. If you don't have access to one in whatever rendering tool you're using, don't fear, because all you need to do is create two cameras. That's it. So I could have created, instead of this stereo camera, I could just have created two regular cameras and then rendered once with cam 1 and then rendered once with cam 2. That's all you had to do. And really what the stereo camera is giving us is now if we want to render an animation, we don't have to render it all with the first camera and then render it all with the second camera. It automatically takes care of that for us. All right. So that's how you can actually create a stereo camera. There's nothing really to talk about in terms of its implementation because it's just two cameras. But what we never talk about is how do you view this? So in Houdini, one of the things that you will note is the fact that when you look through the stereo camera, one of the images is red and the other one has a cyan tint. And this is known as Anaglyph. And there's lots of different variations for Anaglyph. Red cyan is a really common one because it gives us some color in our view. And the idea is you would actually be looking at the, it's grabbing in here, the things I have around my desk. You would be looking at the scene with these lovely fashionable glasses, red cyan glasses. And the eye that has the red would see one of the scenes, and the eye that has the cyan would see the other one. So it's a way of filtering out such that one eye gets one image and the other eye gets the other image. This is imperfect technology. There's a lot of bleeding between the two that's going to cause some discomfort. The other thing is that certain colors don't show up very well with red cyan. So it's not perfect technology, but there are other Anaglyph options. For example, you could do red-blue, which only does grayscale images. And of course, another kind, which you're probably familiar with, is if you've ever gone to a movie theater to watch a movie in 3D and they give you those polar glasses. They're the weird sunglasses with the slightly gray lenses. That's actually a form of Anaglyph too, except instead of giving colored lenses, they're polarized lenses. But it's the same idea. Each lens has a slightly different filter, even though you may not be able to perceive it. And it's going to make it so that the left image is given to the left eye and the right image to the right eye. Now, other ways that you can view stereo 3D images include things like free viewing. And this is where you just have the two images side by side and you can just do it. Some people find it easier to do that cross-eyed. I can't do any of it, but I've heard some people can do it. Another technology is active shutter, which I will reach into my box of mystery objects because I just so happen to have active shutter glasses there. And active shutter glasses, if you have a stereo 3D TV at home, there are these cool things here. Yeah. They don't fit over glasses very well. These are actually powered glasses. And you have to charge their batteries up and all of that fun stuff. And they look very innocuous, but actually, these lenses are LCD panels. And when you sync them with the television or the screen, they actually alternate flashing black. Now, you can't perceive this, but what it's doing, because it happens at a rate that the human visual system won't notice. But the idea is that the TV is going to alternate showing you left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right, really, really fast. And then these are going to alternate blocking out the eye that's not supposed to be looking right now. Hence, they have to be synced to the TV to make sure that you're getting the right synchronization. Now, these have kind of fallen out of fashion because these lovely glasses are incredibly fragile and incredibly expensive. Which is why I keep them in their lovely cases, so that they don't get destroyed. Now, there's all kinds of other different things that you can use for viewing stereo 3D content. If you're just using an image, this is a lovely technology for doing just images. These are Viewmasters. It is just a stereoscopic 3D viewing device. You look like this. They have these cool wheels. And the idea is that the image here and the image on the opposite side, the camera, this is going to be for the left eye and this is for the right eye. And this stereo device just makes sure that the right image gets to the right eye. Yes, these are very old. And you might be like, but they don't make those anymore. And I want to tell you, you are right. They don't really make them anymore. It's not here. I have all kinds of fun things in my house. Ha! Found it. You can still get these. So there are companies out there where you can actually get your stereo 3D photos printed as Viewmaster reels. So that's one alternative you have for that. So we've got Anaglyph, we've got Freeview, you've got active shutter with a television, you've got lovely stereo devices like the Viewmaster, and then there are also glasses-free displays. I don't unfortunately have any of those in my arm's reach. But that's things like lenticulars. If you've got a Nintendo 3DS, that is a parallax barrier display where you don't need anything. It just lets you view 3D. The back of my 3D camera actually has one of those on it. But those are special lenses that make sure that they are projecting the right content to the right eye. Which is kind of cool. So that's how you would view it if you were to render a stereo 3D image. All right. Now, I want to talk a little bit about performance, and this seems like a good opportunity because we talked about distributed ray tracing. Throughout the last 6-7 lectures, we have repeated the line, ray tracing is expensive. Global illumination is expensive. Radiosity is expensive. Path tracing is expensive. Rendering is really expensive. And the more quality you want, the more time it's going to take. So we need to find ways to actually improve the cost. Reduce it. So here's an interesting observation. thinking back to the ray tracing and the ray casting algorithm, we note that the work that each ray does is completely independent of every other ray. Now, that's not 100% true when we're thinking about distributed ray tracing, but actually kind of is. Because even if we need 100 rays to be sent in order to get the color of one pixel, each of those individual rays technically is working completely independent of all of the others until the very end. So since the rays' operations are completely independent, it makes them a key candidate for parallelization. Now, what do I mean by that? So there's two different ways that you can operate. You can operate serially, which is like a lineup. So all of the little triangles get in a good line, and they each go one at a time. So this triangle goes, when this triangle is done, then the next triangle goes, and then the next, and the next, and the next. That's serial execution. And the ray tracer that you implemented or helped implement in assignment 1, that was a serial ray tracer, one ray at a time, really slow. But what if you did this instead? What if we let each ray go at the same time? Is that even possible? It is possible. Not all of them can go at the same time. We're not, unless you're Pixar, which I'm not. But the idea here is that behind parallel is that instead of each ray waiting its turn, we're now going to say each ray gets its own computation device and we can compute them all at the same time. And I think mentally you should be able to see the difference between how fast this would be compared to how fast this diagram would be. But in order to make that possible, we actually need to have hardware that supports doing multiple things at the same time. And good news is we do have that. So you have two options. You have your CPU. So for example, that's your central processing unit, your main computer chip. My laptop, which is over here, has an Intel i9 with 8 cores in it, and each of those cores can run 2 threads per core, which means it can do 16 threads or 16 sets of instructions in parallel at the same time. So 16 rays can be computed at the same time. Not bad. The computer that I am recording this video on is a Ryzen 9, and that's from AMD. And it has 16 cores, and it can do 32 rays at a time. But my GPU can do more. So my desktop here has a 2080 RTX in it, and my laptop here has a 3080 RTX in it. NVIDIA cards. And the 3080 here has over 6,000 cores. And each of those cores can run a single thread, which means a single ray, which means I can do over 6,000 rays at the same time on my graphics card. It's really fast. Really, really fast. We can get hundreds of times faster implementation of these things using our graphics cards to do the job instead of our CPUs, which always leads people to ask the question, why don't we use our GPUs for everything? Well, there's a reason. A graphics processing unit is an incredibly specific device. It lacks a lot of general features that your CPU has. So it doesn't have things like branch prediction, which is something that helps predict whether you're going to take this, if this is going to be true or that's going to be true. And there's a number of other things that are causing the GPUs. They're just not meant for general execution, but they can do ray tracing, and they can do it really, really fast. So the next question has to be that given that we can now do multiple rays being computed at the same time using our GPU or our CPU, are we at a point where we can do real-time ray tracing? Well, what does that mean to be real-time? So I just want to let you know that the word real-time actually has a lot of different definitions, and it really depends on the context under which you're using it. What we are referring to real-time in computer graphics as usually being, it's computed right at the time that you're displaying it on the screen, so there's no noticeable delay to the viewer. So things like a game, that would be rendered in real time. Now that doesn't typically use ray tracing, but it is rendered at real time. These days, 60 plus frames per second desired. The idea is that it's not happening, it's not a pre-computed thing, it's happening right now. It is responding right now to events that are actually we're controlling in the game. And our ability to actually do real-time rendering is really affected by how complex our scene is and how realistic we want it to be. The more triangles you have in your scene, the more complex lighting interactions that you want to be, the harder and harder it will be for something to be rendered as real time. So real-time ray tracing has been a goal for a long time, and we do actually have the ability to do it now. Real-time ray tracing can be done, but in order to do it, we have to make a few concessions. So number one, we already know that ray tracing is exceptionally expensive, just due to the number of rays and photons that you have to do for path tracing and so on. So one of the concessions that we're going to have to make is the concession that maybe we can't render with the same quality in real time that we would offline. So the other thing we're going to need is we're going to need to make heavy use of our graphics card, which has all of those thousands of compute cores to make this happen. So if you've got, a laptop from 10 years ago, it's not going to be able to do it. This is really only something that we've been able to do for the last few years. So the concessions we're making. Going to have to send fewer rays and fewer photons. We need to reduce the number of computations as best as possible. The best thing we can do is to send fewer rays. Obviously, if we send fewer rays, the results are not going to be as smooth, as crisp, as accurate, and so on and so forth. We have seen the results of that. So we're going to get some noisy results. So just to remind you of that. Sorry. So this is a rendering at 1 ray per pixel. This has caustics turned on. And you can see how noisy it is. It took 5 minutes to render that at 1 ray per pixel, because this was not a real-time rendered object. Now, if we had rendered it with 49 rays per pixel, then this would have taken 4 hours to render this very simple image of 4 cups. So the concession I'm making here is I'm going to send fewer rays. But now I have this noisy scene. How do I get rid of the noise? Well, it wasn't a perfect getting rid of the noise because I just implemented a very simple thing. I applied a median filter, which just averages the pixels around you. But it did get rid of a good amount of the noise. And the nice thing about something like a median filter is it's really fast. Like really, 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 really fast. And that's exactly what we're going to do with real-time ray tracing, is we're going to reduce the number of rays drastically. We are accepting that it is going to introduce noise, and we're going to apply a denoising algorithm to the image afterwards. Now, it's not going to be something simple like a median filter or a box blur, because those ended up with this really weird painty look, which we'll talk about again later in the course. But companies like NVIDIA have actually really sophisticated denoising algorithms that often use machine learning to achieve really great denoising. And it's so good that NVIDIA's real-time ray tracer actually only needs half of a ray to 1 ray per pixel. Yeah, that means like for every 2 pixels, you only need like 1 ray. That's really impressive. So we made a huge concession in quality by dumping most of the rays we would traditionally use, and we're going to solve the problem by using denoising, and it works reasonably well. We get pretty decent results. And if you're curious to know more about that, of course, I invite you to go to NVIDIA's website and actually see some of the results of their denoising algorithms. So we've talked about real-time ray tracing. The next thing to talk about is real-time global illumination. Because as we've discovered, when you just try ray tracing on its own, there's a lot of lighting effects that we just don't get. So we don't get caustics. You don't get the indirect lighting as a result of reflections. You don't get diffuse lighting. None of that actually happens. So if we wanted to use algorithms like radiosity and path tracing and photon mapping, is there a way to make them real time? Because as they stand, they are incredibly expensive. And the truth is, you're generally speaking not going to be able to take those particular techniques and apply them in a real-time sense, at least not in any kind of accurate way. But there are, surprisingly, real-time algorithms to give you indirect illuminations. In particular, while it is possible to do caustics in real time, diffuse illumination and indirect illumination is definitely a possibility. Now, the thing to keep in mind is that these methods are not meant to provide approximations or potential solutions to the rendering equation. What we're doing here is we're trying to, as best as possible, create a certain look and create a certain feel at the lowest possible cost. And that is going to come with a loss of accuracy, generally speaking. So there are many, many approaches, but one of the more recent approaches I'd like to briefly introduce you to is by Morgan McGuire and a few other researchers at NVIDIA, and it's called Dynamic Diffuse Global Illumination. And what they've essentially done here, it's kind of an interesting thing, is they've placed these invisible probes throughout the volume of the scene. And this is an image from one of their papers here. And you can see these fuchsia dots are actually where the probes would be positioned. And the idea is that the probes are going to contain information about the indirect lighting. And then when you're trying to compute the surface shading of the area around, of the areas in the scene, instead of actually, directly computing it, you're going to ask the nearby probes, hey, what kind of illumination can you see? The probes are going to store that illumination for us. Now, what's interesting is that this method, you can update the probes periodically so they can respond to things that are moving in the scene. And the actual computation of all of this only takes a few milliseconds. If I remember correctly from the paper, it was less than 5 milliseconds in order to compute this, which is really impressive because a millisecond is not a lot of time. So how the probes are working is they're storing a radiance map, and this typically tends to be a spherical projection. So you can kind of imagine it as when we were doing radiosity, we had a patch, and we asked from this patch, what all can you see? Effectively, what we were doing is we were looking at the world around us and asking what is the total sum of incident light coming into this patch. And there's various ways that you can do this, but one of the things that you could have done was to create this hemisphere picture of everything that you could see from the patch. And effectively, that's what we're doing with these spheres, but except instead of having a hemisphere projection, now we're doing a spherical projection of everything you can see around you. and we store that information in the probes. And you can compute these maps by ray casting and so on to get a sense of what can you see and how is that object lit. And then what you can do is when you're trying to figure out what is the lighting for this particular surface, you can send rays towards each of the 8 nearby probes and triangulate the lighting from them to compute the color of yourself. Apologize, I'm very much losing my voice. So this doesn't give perfect results. It's not going to look exactly like radiosity or path tracing, but the results are very fast. This can be done in real time, and the results are very believable. So some more example images from the McGuire's paper. This is a scene that is rendered with just direct illumination only. And you can see a couple of the probes here. So I think they only actually have 2 probes. And then when they actually do the indirect illumination, this is what they get. So direct with indirect. That's amazing. That is a huge difference. In order to get this effect before, we would have had to have some kind of ambient lighting that's uniform for the whole scene, and it wouldn't really look that good. Whereas here, we're getting all of that just from using these probes. And my understanding is you can do all kinds of other lighting effects with the probes as well. Okay. So this is a really cool, really new thing. And I want to say that this has only really been possible for the last 2 or 3 years. So the idea of real-time ray tracing and real-time indirect lighting, these are very new ideas, and they are still very much works in progress. Now, there's lots of other methods that we could have used to do, by the way, for global illumination that we did not talk about. Radiance maps and importance, I think those have been discussed in one of your previous courses. Another one is ambient occlusion. And then there's an older technique called metropolitan light transport. That one, I will say, however, is definitely not a real-time algorithm due to the random sampling nature it has. There comes a certain point in the day when your honey tea doesn't work anymore. All right. So one of the other things that we really haven't talked about is particle effects. And you might be like, what is a particle effect? Well, if you look around the world, nothing is clean. There is dust and dirt and water droplets and sand everywhere. Things have smoke if they're burning. There's fire. Water pours and splashes. Nothing in this world is perfectly clean, even a clean room. And these actually have a pretty big impact on the appearance of things. And it's one of those things, if you're trying to create a photorealistic scene and your room is sterile, it's because you didn't put any dirt in it, any dust, any particles. And so all of these things we can actually simulate using something called particle effects. And I've snagged a couple images here off of Wikipedia. So the idea behind it, we're going to divide this kind of into 2 sections. You've got particle effects like smoke and explosions, dust and things like that. And then you've got liquids. And interestingly enough, they're all done with particles. So one of the ways that we can create smoke or an explosion really easily is we spawn a whole bunch of invisible particles in the scene. A whole bunch of little points. And then at each of those positions, we're rendering a sprite, remembering that a sprite is just usually a little 2D graphic. Now, you could use volumetric sprites, so things that are actually 3D, but you don't have to. You can use 2D sprites as well. In the 2D sprites, the thing you have to keep in mind is that they need to be camera facing. Because if they're facing away from the camera, you'll see their planar nature. We don't like that. Now, the idea is that you don't just want to use a single sprite to put at each of your little positions. You're going to need an array of different kinds of sprites, so different shapes of sprites, different appearances, different sizes and orientations, so that when you put them together, it actually creates the appearance of whatever it is you're simulating. This is a really great example off of Wikipedia because it actually shows you the different sprites that were used in order to create the explosion. So we have the explosion, and here are some of the different sprites that were used to create this. And you can actually see this here is actually this here. And this here is this one here. So we've got different scales, different orientations of camera-facing planes, different colors, different textures applied, and that has given us the look of a big explosion, and it looks really cool. Now, the question then is, how do you actually place these particles? Where do you put them? How many? Well, the number of particles generally depends on how accurate of a simulation you want. More particles will give you a more detailed, realistic effect, but they come at a pretty high cost because you're putting more things into the scene, more things that have to be simulated. These are usually parameterized, by the way. Then you have the distribution and motion of the particles, and that really depends on the effect that you're creating. And usually we position these using physical simulations. You can do it with manual placement, but that's going to be a very tricky thing. Now, if you open something like Houdini, it's going to take a few minutes. There's lots of different particle effects in Houdini. So we've got, these are the pyro effects. So let's make a smoky torus, I guess. I don't know, why not? So let's do billowy smoke. No, because it's fun. And you can see here that we actually get a bunch of parameters: combustion, shape, color, relationships, and so on. Now, it is not every tool is going to give you all of the opportunities to select every possible parameter for the simulation. But what we have here is the ability to affect things like the cooling rate, the thickness of the smoke. Is this combustion? How much flames do we have? We can adjust ramps, smoke amount. And then we can render it. And there you go. So that's pretty cool. Apparently I opened Houdini twice. So when we did that, what we were doing was we selected the torus as being the particle emitter. And it's going to, based on the kind of effect, it placed particles in that volume according to the effect we were doing. And then it conducted some physical simulation to place the particles and move them about. And then it used, and as you saw, we had parameters about heat, viscosity, all of those wonderful things to help the physical simulation to create a realistic distribution of particle points. We can then render each of those particles using sprites, be they volumetric or 2D. And Houdini is one of the is actually really well known for their support for particle effects. So these are some that I did earlier. I've got some different. This is volcanic smoke. This is just smoke. This one is a fire. The fire didn't show up except in the reflection, which was kind of weird. And then I decided to do one that was a bit more realistic. So we've got the shiny gold object. And then we've got the fireball coming out of the dragon, which is lighting the gold. And the room is filled with this thick, choking smoke. Now, we could have made this even more realistic if we wanted. If the room is filled with a thick, choking smoke, then presumably there should be some ash on the gold statue. Now, that would have to be done via the shader for the golden statue. But that's something you should keep in mind when you're doing this in the future. So this is very much all done with millions of tiny particles. It's pretty cool. And what's interesting is we actually do things like water systems, liquids, and even sometimes like jelly materials are also done using particle systems. Slightly different behavior though. So you would, again, create a volume for the particles to live in because obviously water would spill everywhere. And then you're going to apply Navier-Stokes equations or any other kind of fluid simulation to position those particles, move the particles. It's going to be affected by wind speed, flow rates, temperatures. All of those things are going to be included in that simulation. Now for the rendering of it, this is where things get different. Before, with smoke and fire, we typically had a sprite placed at the position of the particle. What we're going to do now is instead, we are going to generate a mesh or a subdivision surface using those particles from the outermost ones as a reference. So we generate a mesh for the fluid, and then we can render it based on that mesh. Now, sometimes people will use fluid balls, but I think that you get a better appearance when you use the subdivision surface. So, an example here. This is one we can't do with while recording. So I created a large volume and I filled it with particles. Because I created a body of water. This is actually what's known as a flip tank or a flip fluid, which is a pretty common strategy for doing fluids. And you can actually see here a representation of all of the different particles. Now, one of the interesting things when you're doing particle effects is that you have to keep in mind that a simulation has the parameter of time. So if you do not like the appearance of your particle effect at time 0, then just change the time to a different position and maybe you'll like that one better. So this is at time 0. This is the initial position of all of the particles. And when I render it and I paint the bottom of the box with a rocky texture, this is what you get. And there's no wind. It's really, really boring. But you can see some slight distortions where it's kind of got a bit of a rippled surface. But it's not that exciting. We got this rippled surface because we took the particles that were on the top and we turned them into a surface, an actual mesh that we could interact with and treat as something that would refract light and reflect light and so on and so forth. And we can create emitters. I know this looks really funny. So I created a sphere and I made the sphere be a tap. And so I set the tap up to emit water. It is emitting water into the tank. So that's pretty neat. So you can have things like flowing water if you wanted to. And that water, again, we're going to take the particles on the outside, turn that into a mesh that we can now render in an intelligent way. There's also, if we start playing with the parameters, we can start seeing lots of interesting things. And this helps you to see that we have indeed turned the particles into a surface mesh. So I created an ocean tank, and I applied some wind and some waves, and you can see here we're reflecting light, and that's pretty neat. Let's crank up the wind. So I cranked up the wind. And the wind was actually so strong that it was blowing the water right off the ocean floor, which was kind of cool. And it's sloshing up against the sides of the tank that I put it in. But this gives you a really neat idea as to how we can, actually render fluids. Yeah, you can see where a few particles were left behind, just as the wind is blowing things off. So it is possible to do lots of things with particles: smoke, fire, explosions, water, oceans. But there's lots yet still. So there's other things that use particle effects that we probably aren't thinking about. Grass, hair, and any kind of like thread or strand-based object can actually be done with a particle effect. Now, the difference between how those are handled and how smoke and fire and water would be handled is that with smoke and fire and water, the particle's previous position is discarded. We don't care where it used to be, we care where it is now. When we're dealing with hair, we are keeping track of the lifespan of the particle. So not just the particle's initial position or their current position, but every position it has taken in between. It creates a strand. And you can apply the same physics simulations to those strands. And that's one of the ways that you can create hair. So indeed, Houdini also has some great hair libraries. What I did here is I created a sphere and then I placed some hair. Now, this is one of those things where you can specify the length, which is how long you want it to render the lifetime of the particles to be, how many particles, you can set distributions and so on. And that created a hairball where everything was pointing outwards, and it was really boring because that's not what hair does. Even my son, whose hair stands out, it's curly. So there are tools that we can use to brush the hair, that is, alter the trajectory of those particles to move the strands. So this one I did some shaping, and then I did a little bit more, and then I played around with the shader that was used on the hair. So these are all really cool things because this gives us the ability to now render all of those different effects that we would see in a realistic scene. You want to have a plushie in the corner? Okay, make the plushie model, apply some hair. You want some water pouring in the sink, some liquid in the cup? You can do that with particle effects. Other things that we can do with particle effects, we'll talk about that other slide in a minute. Snow, rain, dust, sand, dirt, all of these different things can be achieved through particle effects. And in fact, if you go through Houdini, a lot of those things are already there and waiting for you to play with. All right. So the next topic in our smorgasbord of wrapping up photorealistic rendering is testing. So inevitably when you go online, whether it's YouTube or Google or Wikipedia, maybe you're reading research papers, you will see a lot of the same 3D models used over and over and over and over again. What is up with that? So it's true. And in fact, one of the most common models you are going to see is a teapot. This lovely teapot right here. I'm sure you've all seen it a million times. Why are you seeing this teapot? This is known as the Utah teapot. It was created as a 3D scanned model in 1975. It's old. Yes, computer graphics has been around for that long. Actually, I have some cool videos. They are old VHS videos that I scanned in eons ago. I should make a note. It might be fun as just something to do on the last day to see some of these. Anyways. It was scanned in by a gentleman named Martin Newell, and he scanned in a 70s Melita teapot because he needed a model, and there weren't a lot of models, and I'm assuming it was in the lab. And if you've ever looked at a research lab in a university, there's all kinds of odd things lying around. And maybe that was in the room. So he scanned it in to create some test geometry. And now, if you actually look at the real teapot, the real teapot is actually a bit taller. He scaled it down, squashed it down, and people argued that it actually was more pleasing squashed down, and it's kind of stuck. And this model is actually used for testing a lot of different shaders, vertex shaders, fragment shaders, rendering equations, ray tracing, because you could use just the Platonic solids, sphere, cube, tetrahedron, octahedron, all those things. But none of them have any, aside from sphere, they don't have any interesting shapes. And so the teapot actually poses as a really interesting model with lots of different kinds of surfaces. It's got, convex and concave, and it's really cool. And so you'll see the teapot a lot. Rendered it with a couple things. And in fact, it's Pixar RenderMan's logo. And if you ever get to go to SIGGRAPH, and I highly recommend you do, there is the Pixar booth. They have a tradition of having, and I should have brought them down, but unfortunately they're all packed up right now. You get these wind-up teapots in these collector tins, and every year Pixar makes a different collectible wind-up teapot. And there's a specific time on a specific day of the conference where they will hand out these teapots. And so when you start to see the line at the conference forming in the exhibition hall, you're like, I don't know what this line is. You should get in that line. It's the teapot line. There are very few of them. And so when they're out, they are out. But they're really cool little teapots. And they have all kinds of different ones. And what's interesting is that they've actually become quite collectible. And if you go on things like eBay or your auction site of choice, you can actually find them. From the conference, people will actually try to sell. They're given away freely at the conference, but they're so prized that they sell for like $100 or more on eBay. I have a few of them. I wish I had more. They're really cute. Really, really, really cute. Okay, maybe now I just want to bring one up here. So let's do that. Let's find pics. So this is the walking teapot. I think this one is the original one, actually. And I think they redid it in a different year. Anyways, the idea is every year they hand out little models of the teapot. And that is the RenderMan logo. But you'll see it used everywhere. Literally everywhere. Everybody uses the teapot model. And for this course, if you want to use the teapot model, by all means, go right ahead. And yes, there's lots of them. Lots and lots and lots. I have this monster one. Actually, I think mine isn't sparkly, but I have a green one like that. All right. That's enough YouTube. Now, it's not the only one. So this, I think, was probably the first test geometry And then a few other places started doing it as well. So there's another one, and this, yes, this is a computer rendered image. Pretty cool, eh? It looks like a lovely sculpture of a bunny. This is the Stanford bunny, and it is another super popular test model that people use. There are others as well. There's a weird monster character, which I don't know what its name is. It's a really strange monster. I never use it because I don't like it. I like the teapot and I like the bunny, so those are the two I tend to use. There's a weird monster character. There's the Cornell box. Now the Cornell box isn't something like, you know, oh, a fancy box. The Cornell box is actually a rendering environment that's used for testing environment. Different lighting and different materials. And we actually use this in our global illumination section. It's most commonly used to demonstrate global illumination. It's essentially a simple box with a red wall and a green wall, or a red wall and a blue wall, an aerial light at the top, and then some stuff inside. And the idea is you're using this to test out different illuminations. And it's called the Cornell box, of course, because it's from Cornell University. There is also a dragon, which you have seen me use. The dragon, of course, is, no, it's not in there. I just want to find the dragon, so, because I would like to show it to you again. But, let's find the famous dragon model, which I actually have been using. So that's actually not it. So there's two dragon models. And you've seen me use this one that has a base. This is not the one. It's very similar to the one, but it is not the one. Of course, I'm going to find out that I haven't actually been using the real one, which would be amusing and sad. I know it's in here somewhere. That's path tracing. It's not my caustics. It's not my caustics. It's that one right there. Sorry, that took me a minute to find. This is one of the other really famous models, is this dragon. It's a cool model to use, and I think this was, again, where do these models come from? People needed some kind of interesting 3D geometry to use for testing a material, testing behavior. Boxes, toruses, cubes, and spheres are boring. They grab something and they scan it. So there's a dragon, there's a monster figure, there's the Stanford bunny, the teapot. There's also a Buddha statue that you will also see used as well. Although the teapot, the bunny, and the dragon are probably the most popular. Yeah. So I want to kind of end this little section by talking about how to build a photorealistic scene. Because we've been working towards creating the most photorealistic scene possible. And you might be thinking, well, just throw some stuff into the thing and we'll hit render and it'll be photoreal, right? It takes a bit more effort. The first thing that you need to do is actually design the scene that you're trying to create. Because if you just do it from your head, you're going to end up with something that doesn't really make a lot of sense. So, for example, this one here. The reason why this particular scene is not a good example of a photorealistic scene, aside from the fact that I was doing some extreme things to make it look like there was dispersion, is the lighting. Why would we have a spotlight shining exactly like that? We have a hard shadow. We have no surrounding environment. It's just a gem on a plane. There's nothing about the scene that makes any sense. If we want to create a photorealistic scene, we actually need to design it. And one of the best things that you could do is actually create a real world mock-up. Maybe you don't have the exact objects, but you could create a rough layout and then take a photo with the lens that you were trying and at the distance that you're trying to recreate, because you have a goal in mind and it's good to visualize it instantly like that. Now, one of the reasons why creating the mock-up is really important is because of scale. One of the things that I usually find is a giveaway in these Faker Photo challenges is the scale of the objects. Now, most of them do a pretty good job. They never used to, though. And that is, so let's pick some random objects off my desk. I'm in the process of packing things up, so everything is always a mess in my house. So I've got a curtain pin, which is tiny. And my curtain pin, and I've got this Viewmaster reel. Okay. These two objects are different sizes. But it wouldn't do for this object to be the same size as this one. Likewise, if I wanted to have some Viewmasters in the scene, the actual device, physical unit, if the wheel wouldn't actually fit in the machine, then it doesn't make sense. So when you're doing these scenes, you have to make sure that the scale of the objects makes sense. Not just of the individual object, but of the object with respect to the other things in the scene. That can be a tricky task, which is why creating a mock-up can actually be very helpful. Yes, I have a ton of these things. I have 5 or 6 of them. So that's the first recommendation. When it comes to your project, which I will be releasing details about the project probably in the next 10 days, make sure you follow some of these guides. And I will ask you probably to submit evidence of, actually having a design and so on. So after you've designed your scene, taken some mock-ups, drawn some mock-ups, you want to source your assets. Now, you might be creating all of the assets for your scene yourself, and if so, make them. But you might not want to make all of them yourself, because let's be honest, if you wanted to create a realistic horse asset, that would take a lot of work, and maybe you don't have a reference horse to work from. So whether you're creating your own assets or finding them and buying them, before you set the scene up, you've actually got to acquire all these assets. Once you get the assets, then you can actually put them into the scene and frame the scene. Now, part of this is also going to be applying textures and so on, which we do in the next step, though. So when we're sourcing assets, don't forget to actually get the textures. Set up your scene using your mock-up to give as a guide, and then apply your appropriate materials. So that could be textures, bump maps, displacement maps. That could be writing custom shaders, for example, to give an iridescent appearance, or a subsurface scattering appearance that has multiple layers. There's lots and lots and lots of different things that you will need to consider when you're looking at materials. You may need to manipulate vertices, normals, BRDFs. You need to make sure you consider each object individually to make sure that you're getting the right appearance. And consider having very rich textures with multiple layers. All right. So once you've done all that, then you can render. It takes some time. Make sure that when you render, you are using the absolute best settings that you possibly can. The most rays, the highest quality, because if you're trying to trick someone into believing that something is real, you actually need to produce it smoothly and accurately. So that's kind of a rough guide for building a photorealistic scene. And throughout everything thus far, you should know roughly how to create each of these different kinds of materials. So you should be able to do reflections, refractions, displacement mapping, vertex shading, all of those things we've kind of covered. And you should, even if you haven't had direct experience, hopefully those concepts are familiar to you now so that you can go and create your own photorealistic scene. So, with that, our course is going to take a big shift now. We're going to move from photorealistic to non-photorealistic. And in the non-photorealistic side, now we're going to start playing with the shaders a little bit to make them do something different. And it's going to be fun, I think. Okay. I don't think. I love non-photorealistic rendering. It's a lot of fun. Because even when you make a mistake, you often get a really cool result. So, a few review questions just to think of on your own. And in our next lecture, we will start with a general overview of non-photorealistic rendering and the various methods that we use to create different effects.